And now, if you have questions, feel free to interrupt me. I don't mind. This is kind of a potpourri talk, and I might otherwise go at lightning speed. So don't hesitate to interrupt me. The way this talk came about was I really like giving scary talks that keep everybody up at night. And this is one of them. But there's a lot of stuff in InfoSec that people know about, that people worry about, that people want to get better at. I was interested in talking about the things that are real risks that have been used in real attacks, but that people don't necessarily anticipate or don't think about or don't perceive as areas of risk. And I was talking with a colleague about this, and that colleague said, well, that kind of attack is completely unrealistic. This protocol you're talking about is well-designed, it's field-tested. I've been doing this for 20 years, and this kind of attack, I don't think it really exists. And of course, I had to name the talk Rodents of Unusual Size after that. So I work at Let's Encrypt. We are a free, nonprofit TLS certificate authority. So if you need a TLS, used to be called SSL certificate for your website, for your application, we will give this out free with an automated API that's, I think, very pleasant to use and pleasant to automate and maintain and interact with. And we are now the largest certificate authority by number of sites protected by quite a large margin. And we've only been doing this for 2 or 3 years now. We've been in production. I mentioned we're a nonprofit. We love individual donations. We also love corporate sponsorships. And if you might be interested in helping us out with that, if you might be a good champion for us in your organization, we would love to talk to you. At least one, I think a couple of my colleagues are here tonight who know more than I do on the fundraising side. Speaking of which, we are also hiring for fundraising and for SRE. So you get to work with me on the SRE team and hear my terrible jokes all day, every day. So that's a plus. But we are a 100% remote team, which is really, really nice and enjoyable. So enough about Let's Encrypt for now. We'll get back to that and the things we worry about. What I'm talking about today are classes of things, systems, infrastructure, parts of society even, that we don't necessarily like, we don't necessarily think of as trustworthy, or maybe we do, but we trust them anyway. But the organizations and governments and so on who run these systems may be trustworthy, but they can be subverted, and attacks on them can be directed at you and they can affect you. Regardless of what type of system you're running. If you're running an ordinary non-tech organization, these can be real issues. If you're running SaaS, these can be real issues, etc. And I had to cut down this list a lot to fit this talk into less than 3 or 4 hours. So attackers are not necessarily thinking of the things that you're thinking about protecting. You may be looking at the security of the code in your application, validating user input, worried about your web stack, worried about your server infrastructure. Attackers don't have that limitation. There's a lot I could talk about that's really more on the business or accounting side that I'm going to skip. But there's still a lot within your scope that you probably have some influence over that you may not be thinking about attacks on. So my other job, I'm also an attorney. I don't practice tech law, but I follow a lot of tech law stories because it's where my 2 careers and spheres of geekdom join up. And one of the things we see in the legal system is people thinking that it's better organized than it is. Here in Minnesota, anyway, most of my legal work is done by mail and phone and fax. And how do you authenticate a legal demand letter or a court order or something like that? You think, well, this is formal. It's a formal request. This couldn't possibly be forged, could it? That would be breaking the law. Well, attackers are breaking the law already. And a motivated attacker is not going to see any limitation in forging a court order. And in some of the examples I have up here, that's exactly what we've seen. These 3 gentlemen whose names are in the examples are all people with, I'll describe it as strong opinions, who felt that having competing opinions on the internet was undesirable in some way. and obtained court orders to have that content taken down. Except by obtained, I mean forged. 2 of those people were convicted, and this happens more than you might think. With YouTube, you may have heard about this more in the media recently. Attackers have been holding monetized YouTube channels for ransom, demanding Bitcoin in exchange for not sending forged takedown notices to YouTube. And the reason that works is because YouTube is a platform that operates at such large scale. They can't properly vet every legal demand they receive. That's just not how the takedown system works, or can work at their scale. And that makes them vulnerable. This makes a lot of organizations you may do business with vulnerable, like your domain name registrar or your CDN. Especially if you're a smaller player, do you really think that your hosting service or your IaaS platform is going to be calling up attorneys and verifying that they really sent this demand letter? Probably not. So if you might potentially be faced with this kind of attack, you need to have the kind of relationship with your vendors where you know that they're not going to act on the first form letter they receive without a human being pausing to think, what's really going on here? The defense distributed example is even more fun and even more scary. Defense distributed distribute plans for 3D printing firearms. And they asked a court recently to intervene in a takedown notice from the New Jersey Attorney General, which wasn't. Either they forged a takedown notice against themselves in order to give themselves standing to go to court, or someone else forged a takedown notice for reasons unknown, possibly the lulz. Neither of these are good things. So moving on to the telephone system. We all know that cell phone companies have kind of questionable customer service in large part, and they can be social engineered. This has been a pretty popular, pretty well-covered attack for at least 4 or 5 years now. And this is a tweet from a few years ago where an activist got his cell phone account taken over by an attacker just calling in, pretending to be him, and using sensitive personal information. But the thing is, it's not difficult to get part of somebody's social security number. That's not really information that should be used for authentication. But in this case, Verizon, it was enough. And this still happens a lot. It's very, very difficult to have customer service take every security measure to authenticate a customer without really, really being annoying to customers who need customer service right now and don't want to go through all these steps. And that's not the only risk with the telephone system. Local number portability, to move a phone number to another carrier, potentially on an account controlled by the attacker, just needs a letter with the current account holder's details and account number and a signature. Trivial to forge. Voice over IP, usually not end-to-end encrypted. So any kind of man-in-the-middle attack is going to tend to be very successful unless you have one of very, very few providers that actually do end-to-end encryption. Physical wiretaps hopefully aren't a risk for you, but they're always there. And the newest and, I think, scariest attack on the telephone system is on the routing and switching infrastructure itself, which is called SS7 for Signaling System 7, I think it is. And the SS7 network is not very well documented in public. It's very, very difficult to gain access to. You have to be a telephone company. So there's some implicit trust involved. You have to be a telco, so you can't be a malicious actor trying to hijack text messages, right? Well, not unless you have $10,000, which a journalist found out is about what you need to spend to get access to SS7 and hijack whatever phone numbers you want. For a motivated attacker, that is not a large budget. And a motivated attacker might be trying to intercept, let's say, 2-factor codes for bank accounts that are sent over SMS. And this is now exactly what's happening. It happened in Germany in 2017, and it just happened this year. I think this article came out within the past few weeks in the UK. And when a spokesperson in the UK says this is not an isolated case, that is especially scary because you have to account for British understatement. So that's very, very bad. So what on earth can you do about these things? Like, I'm here to scare all of you, and that's fun. but I want to give you some useful information that you can use to try to mitigate some of these attacks, hopefully without putting in too much energy, too much massive amounts of engineering. Some telephone companies will let you set passphrases or passcodes on personal accounts, like cell phone accounts. So when you call in, you have to give a PIN. And they're not perfect about it, but that's absolutely better than nothing. It's really fast and easy to do. And that can add a great deal of security against simple social engineering. Sort of a more lateral thinking approach you can use is if an attacker might find out, your lead sysadmin's cell phone number, again, not too difficult to do. Have all of your sensitive accounts, sensitive credentials, use a phone number that nobody knows, that isn't out there. Then the attacker is not going to know what number to try to hijack. It's pretty straightforward. It's a little bit of a pain to get a second phone, keep it in the safe, or what have you, but it's not that difficult. And if you have a high-stakes kind of need or application or a large bank account, that's a really good and really simple mitigation. And the same thing goes for postal addresses. If you're a large organization with a mailroom that might not know how to route something strange or important, or it might go to a department that isn't going to vet it and may not understand the importance of something like a notice from your domain registrar, get a PO box. Check the PO box. A little bit of a pain, but much, much easier than trying to train everyone in your organization's mail flow to be on the lookout for certain things. So moving harder into technology, third-party websites are something that we all depend on very, very greatly. And most people are familiar with the general outlines here right now of embedding content from third-party websites being a pretty big risk. And we see credentials that are either shared with other websites or that your users try to use for your site that are shared with other websites. They get breached. Bad things happen. So a really, really cool resource for dealing with this problem is Have I Been Pwned, which hopefully you've heard about. It is a great service, a great website. And it will tell you if your email address is associated with any set of credentials that has become public in a data breach. And the guy who runs this, Troy Hunt, has millions and millions and millions and millions of rows of breach data that he'll let you query. He won't actually show you the password, but he'll tell you something associated with your email address is definitely breached. There's an even more clever way that you can use this data to protect your end users. So if you're worried about your employees, you can subscribe to a service on Have I Been Pwned and say, whenever something in this domain name I control has been breached, let me know. But when a user goes to enter a password for an account they're creating or updating on your site, there's now a JavaScript library called PassProtect, where running entirely on the client side in your end user's web browser, it can reach out to Have I Been Pwned and check a hash of the password that the user's trying to use, see if it's been breached, without exposing that password to anything outside the browser itself. So this is very, very cool and keeps your users from using credentials that have already been breached elsewhere. Even if you are doing password strength tests or that kind of thing, this will catch previous breaches. Some other things for dealing with third-party websites that you interact with getting breached. Content security policy is a way to control what permissions that content you embed actually can have in the user's web browser. I'm not a front-end developer, but this is very cool, but also very complicated. Sub-resource integrity will also let your web page say, I'm embedding this resource from a third-party CDN or some other host. But if it doesn't have this particular cryptographic hash, don't load this resource because something is wrong. Very simple, very, very powerful. So I've talked a little bit about domain registrars in examples so far, and this is where third-party infrastructure that you depend on gets pretty scary, because a lot of us tend to trust our registrars, and with any big target, as historic attackers have said, that's where the money is, banks. So we don't go robbing individual people, we rob banks. It's great. And this has now started happening with domain registrars. They're very susceptible to document forgery because a lot of domain registrar customers tend not to interact with the registrar very much. They'll lose track of passwords. The people who set up the account will have left the organization, and they need to regain access very urgently. So we're talking about a lot of faxes on corporate letterhead or from attorneys. And just earlier I was talking about forgery. That's a huge, huge risk here. A lot of registrars still operate this way. Other social engineering works just as well on domain registrars as well. Another kind of take on this is if you don't monitor your messaging, be it email or phone or regular mail, for communications from your registrar, you may miss important notices, like somebody has filed a trademark dispute about the ownership of your domain name. And it is entirely possible that if you miss that notice, if you don't respond to the trademark dispute, your domain name will get seized by a third party who supposedly owns that trademark, but maybe is just counting on you to not check your email. And if you lose a UDRP dispute, you're going to have a heck of a time getting that domain back. Typo squatting is a classic one. I think we all know about, registering domains that are pretty common typos of your real domain name. And then DNS request hijacking is one where it starts getting even more technical. So if somebody in a coffee shop is browsing to your website, you may have end-to-end encryption. But if the domain resolver they're using is actually the evil person sitting next to them intercepting the Wi-Fi connection, they're going to get misdirected. And this is why end-to-end encryption is really, really important, which we'll get into a little bit more. Before I go on, though, one currently developing situation with DNS is we just a couple weeks ago learned about a pattern of attacks on Middle Eastern governments where their name servers were changed for very sensitive domain names at intelligence agencies and similar. And the current theory is that attackers were actually doing man-in-the-middle attacks between registrars and the central domain name registries, the people who operate the top-level domain names. I want to talk a lot more about that when we find out what actually happened. But what you can do about many of these registry or DNS-related attacks is keep your account info up to date with your registrar. If a person leaves the organization, a lot of registrars still operate sort of on the basis of individual accounts, not role accounts. So you need to keep an eye on those and make sure they get updated so the right people get access, the wrong people don't retain access, and notices go to the right place. Monitoring your domain name registration, making sure the name servers remain where they should be, is something that should ideally be a part of your monitoring system all the time. For typo squatting, you can do protective domain name registrations, like I said, registering common typos, but there's a limit to how many typos you can register. There's no limit to how many typos end users can make. Have a good relationship with your domain registrar. So if you're running, a mid-sized organization, maybe your domain shouldn't be registered with $10 domains .some country code, where your founder figured they could get a cheap domain 15 years ago and never changed. This happens all the time. And there are lots of good registrars out there, some of whom specialize in security or high-value domains. And some of those are not even as expensive as that might make you think. Two-factor authentication, always, if you can. There's also a feature with some registrars where you talk to them, you pay some extra money, but not a lot, and they will work with the TLD operator, with the registry, so that no domain transfers can sneakily happen, no name server changes can sneakily happen without humans in the compliance department with no sense of humor vetting that your request actually came from you. And this is great. However, be specific when you talk to your domain registrar about this. This service is called Registry Lock with the .com and .net registry, which sounds an awful lot like Registrar Lock, which is a status that says, hey, this domain doesn't resolve right now, it's frozen. Let's Encrypt had this happen, and we were very upset and very embarrassed. Please don't make our mistake. Please over-communicate when you request this from your registrar. And one thing I like that literally nobody else likes is DNSSEC, where your name server cryptographically signs its responses. So because DNS is not an end-to-end encrypted protocol, this at least provides some integrity of the DNS records that you're serving up. But this is really, really, really difficult to run well operationally. This requires a lot of sophistication, and I have done it wrong many times trying to run it. So this is really something where you need to consider the risk-reliability trade-off and whether it's worth it for your organization to try to do this right. It takes a lot of effort. I still do it because I'm like that, and I recommend it if you have the same risk posture I do, which hopefully you don't because I don't sleep well. So we were talking about end-to-end encryption, and it's really, really good. But there are some ways that incompletely implemented or even completely implemented encryption can be worked around or subverted. So one of them is TLS stripping. If you have a protocol, and the best example of this these days is SMTP, which underlies email, that doesn't always run on top of TLS. And HTTP is another good example. That initial connection from the user to the server, where the server says, hey, I can do encryption, why don't you do encryption? And the client says, okay. If during that initial connection there's a man-in-the-middle attacker who simply takes away that offer of encryption, the client knows no better, will not go over to HTTPS, will not start TLS within the SMTP session, and then that session remains open to meddling by the attacker. So you can fully support encryption, but it can just be worked around, unless you do one of a few things depending on the protocol to try to enforce the end-to-end encryption. And another thing is impersonation, and this is where we get into the stuff Let's Encrypt worries about. We do not want to issue a certificate for Google.com to anybody. We don't even want to issue it to Google because they get really angry about that kind of thing, even if they did request it. A lot of organizations are like that. They don't want their little marketing site to be getting a cert from anyone other than their enterprise-controlled certificate plan, and for good reason, for very good compliance reasons. So what can you do to avoid TLS stripping and impersonation? To fight TLS stripping, HSTS, or HTTP Strict Transport Security, is really easy to implement as long as all of your, ideally all of your websites, but all of your content on the domain is available securely. So the way this works is the web browser will connect to the server, and the server sends back a strict transport security header that tells the client, please cache the fact that all connections to me in the future should always be over HTTPS. If something tries to go HTTP, something is wrong, don't let the end user do that. And it's great, it works very, very well. But it is an example of trust on first use, or tofu, which is very palatable, but there can be problems, and it really depends on your taste. If the very first time a user connects to your site is when there's a man-in-the-middle attack, if they're connecting to your site for the very first time from the malicious Starbucks, then you still have that problem, and there is not really a good way to work around it. Except if you fill out the HSTS preload submission form and you're serving up the headers properly, web browsers will build in to the browser the fact that your domain is one of those that should always be connected to securely. Then you're fully protected, and that's great. Protecting against certificates that should not have been issued for your domain is complex, and there are a few ways you can do that. The easiest is what's called CAA records. These are DNS records that a certificate authority like us will check before they issue a certificate. And if your domain has a CAA record that says, only let, let's say, DigiCert issue, we will not issue. Every CA has to check CAA records. It's part of the industry compliance guidelines we have to follow in order to be trusted by web browsers. Now, if we're subject to a man-in-the-middle attack while we're trying to check for CAA records, that's another story, and I'll get to that. And this is what keeps me up at night. Another thing you can do is monitor certificate transparency logs, which our executive director, Josh, just gave a talk about yesterday. These logs, you have to, if you're a CA, under these same guidelines, you're required to submit every certificate you issue to these publicly available logs. And you can watch these, or there are services that will watch them for you. And you'll get flagged every time a cert is issued for your domain name. And that can be another part of your monitoring. When you issue a cert, you know to expect to see that in logs. And if you see a cert you're not expecting, something is probably wrong. DANE is pretty niche. It's probably only of interest if you're building your own protocol stack without built-in mandatory encryption, which, why would you do that? Don't do that. So what still keeps us up at night, and what is kind of an unsolved problem, and it's definitely a problem if you're not using solid end-to-end encryption already, is subversion of internet routing itself. That's how a man in the middle can get in the middle without necessarily being right there in the coffee shop or literally pulling a sneakers and breaking into your building and messing with your phone wiring. So here's a very broad and inaccurate summary of how internet routing works. You probably, unless you're a very large corporation, don't have routers that speak BGP, but your ISP does. And BGP is the border gateway protocol that defines how packets are routed throughout the entire internet. So your ISP may have one or two or several hundred other ISPs that they talk to. And over BGP, they obtain from all of these people that they connect to a list of routes that those people have and where those routes in turn lead. And BGP is interested in sending a packet along the shortest path by system number. So AS up here stands for Autonomous System, and it's basically just an organization. BGP doesn't care if the path is really the fastest. It just cares about what are the fewest intermediate organizations I can use to route this packet. So if your ISP has two upstream providers and CenturyLink has a slightly longer path to reach visitfinland.com than Sandwich does, it'll go over Sandwich. But if Sandwich is malicious, or somebody has compromised a router within Sandwich to be malicious, then they can work whatever dire shenanigans they have in mind on your packets, and you'll be none the wiser. Nor will the person on the other end, unless you have strong end-to-end encryption. The attacker does not even have to be this subtle, because let's say your ISP connects to a bunch of people on a regional internet exchange, and one of them is some sketchy company that just got a port and got connected because we're a free open internet, and this is genuinely a good thing. But it has these outcomes where people can participate in the network without being trustworthy. They can participate on this very deep level without being trustworthy. I personally am on 2 international internet exchanges. It did not cost me very much money. And I'm trustworthy, but how on earth do you know that? So this participant, totally legitimate hosting, I'm sure it's fine. They say, well, they don't even have to worry if they want to be really noisy about hijacking. If they don't care what happens afterwards, they make their money and they're out. They can just say, the real provider advertises that the route to this IP address is part of this big bundle of IPs, a /17. That's many, many thousands of IPs. This is how providers tend to announce IP space because it's efficient. You don't want every router to have learned routes for every single different IP address. So we aggregate them into these larger blocks. But a /24 is only 256 IP addresses. And internet routing prefers the most specific block of IP addresses it can find a route to. So any provider with any path advertising a route to 256 IPs is going to be preferred over any provider announcing a route to many thousands of IPs, even if the path looks worse. So an attacker who wants to make sure their attack will work, who doesn't care about being noisy, can just do this, and they will basically always succeed. Now, these are the kinds of attacks where network engineers say, well, big providers in the United States, they're sophisticated. They would never fall for this kind of attack. They'd vet everyone they peer with. This wouldn't happen. I've never seen this happen. This absolutely has happened. The kind of funniest, I would say, but people really lost money here. One recent very real example was Bitcoin mining pools were not using end-to-end encryption in many cases. So a couple years ago, if you were participating in a Bitcoin mining pool, you were mining Bitcoin on your device, sending the results up to a mining pool, the purpose of which is to aggregate everyone's fines and just split up any monetary gains between all the participants. So you don't have to find the lucky block. You can just help find the lucky block, and you'll get your little proportion of it. But it wasn't encrypted. And somebody had the great idea, what if I just do this type of hijacking attack on the mining pool? Then everyone's Bitcoin blocks that they find will be sent to me. And it absolutely worked, and they made $80,000. They could have made a lot more, but they messed up in trying to get a TLS certificate issued, which they could have done if they tried. I don't like that, but they could have. So at Let's Encrypt, we are benefiting from some really cool research done by a team at Princeton who are working on approaches and heuristics for certificate authorities like us to use multiple perspectives around the internet with diverse routing so that if we see one or two results come back with a different IP or a different route than others, we know something's probably amiss. Lots more complexity around that, lots more to come. We're working on implementing this, and we're probably going to be one of the first CAs to do this. But right now, the state of the industry is this is a difficult enough attack to mitigate that CAs aren't even expected to try because it's genuinely very, very hard to solve. And that's really scary. But there are mitigations, and some of them are not completely terrible. So, like I keep saying, mandatory end-to-end encryption really, really helps here. For everything except the very specific types of attack, like trying to get the TLS certificate. If your customer's sessions to you are encrypted, it doesn't matter if their packets get hijacked because the encryption protects it. And when I say encryption, I also mean authentication, which is part of HTTPS, part of TLS. You can monitor your internet routes. So a couple of the services up here, like BGPmon, and there are several others, some free, some paid, some very paid, will notify you if something looks amiss with the way packets are being routed to your IP space. If you're in AWS, this probably doesn't help you so much, but if you control your own endpoints, if you have your own IP space, this is actually fairly easy to monitor, and you'll at least be able to respond better and detect attacks pretty well. If you have a very sensitive endpoint, announcing it as a part of a /24 as a more specific prefix means that an attacker isn't going to be able to do that really easy attack where they announce only a /24. Most ISPs won't keep routes that are smaller than a /24, that are more specific than that. So you're pretty safe with that. There's a system called RPKI that uses cryptography, once again, our favorite thing, to cryptographically sign attestations of which internet routes are actually permissible for our IP space. This is pretty hard to implement. It's early days, but it's very exciting. And once more ISPs get on board with this, it has the potential to very, very much limit this kind of attack and its usefulness. And then finally, again, if you're willing to make that usability trade-off with implementing DNSSEC, the combination of that and CAA records in DNS will keep certificate authorities from issuing, even if there is a BGP hijack. That's the best complete mitigation that I know of right this second. And again, that's hard to implement, but if you're really, really concerned about security, that's what I would do. So that's what I've got. I'm very, very happy to hear your questions about the presentation, about Let's Encrypt, about these things that keep me up at night. And thanks for coming.
Okay. I mean, I could just start asking questions now because I probably have some, but I think I see one hand. Why not?
How concerned are you about RSA downgrade attacks? And would you promote people to use ECC?
That's a great question. So RSA is one of, to simplify it, because I'm not fully a cryptographer myself, RSA is one of the cryptographic sets of algorithms and technologies used in end-to-end encryption over TLS, or usually used. And there are some ways you can implement it, certain cipher suites that use it, that are weaker than others. And an attacker can potentially trick one side of a connection into requesting a weaker cipher suite from the server, or vice versa from the client. That's your question, right? That is an issue that is, in many contexts, is pretty easily overcome by by specifying really good cipher suites on the server side and enforcing that. Mozilla has a great page up on their website. If you Google for Mozilla server-side TLS, it has an excellent and easy-to-follow guide of setting good cipher suites on the server side. That said, there are questions about whether quantum computers are going to make RSA completely broken, and if that'll happen, when that will happen, if it's already happened. The next generation of cryptography is, in this context, is based around elliptic curves, which I do not understand in the slightest. But it's basically a different signing algorithm and a different way of negotiating, from what I understand. Today, most CAs, including Let's Encrypt, will sign a certificate that you request using ECDSA, and that will absolutely work. The full chain, including Let's Encrypt's root, is not yet ECDSA, but we want to get there. But if you're really concerned about algorithms, especially if you're concerned about nation-state kind of attackers who might have the ability to break RSA or might have quantum computers, go to EC. It's also a little bit more computationally efficient. So if you have a huge volume of TLS traffic, you may get a little bit better performance from EC certs. Does that answer everything? Thanks.
I think everyone is probably sitting here going, I am so terrified right now. I'm wondering if you can give us just one or two. You gave us a lot of very specific action items, and I hope you'll post the slides.
I certainly will. And there are links right in there.
Wonderful. But I'm wondering if you can give us like a really broad, okay, if you're suitably terrified right now, when you go back to the office tomorrow, what one or two things should you do like right now?
Check your domain registrar account. Make sure you have the credentials. Make sure the contact info is current. And I think the other thing I would do is, I like your question. Go ahead and check your cipher suite settings, and make sure that you actually are serving up HSDS headers as well. Mozilla's page and their tooling will also give you advice on that, and that will protect a lot of your users from that kind of Starbucks attack very effectively.
Okay, hopefully this doesn't sound dumb, but the internet was created as a trustworthy system, right? Everything was unencrypted. How difficult would it be, has anyone considered starting over?
People sort of have, to my knowledge, but I mean, the whole problem is inertia. That's why we have, email is a great example. Email is an example of one of the few common protocols that still does not have really good end-to-end encryption by default. It has a ton of hacks on top of it to try to add it, and then to try to enforce it, and then enforce it better. And we're never going to solve the spam problem. And that's a great example of inertia. There are so many systems out there using the internet as it is, and using email as it is, and many, many other examples that, and there's so many stakeholders that I don't think we're ever going to get away from building hacks on top of what we have to try to put some spackle in the holes. I think that's what we've got, for better or for worse. Thanks.
All right. Thank you so much again. Thank you, James.
Thank you.